Chapter 10. Fighting Ability. There were many traits to Paul Sykes' character, i.e. quick-witted, intelligent, mischievous, humorous, and brave, etc. But his phenomenal fighting ability was certainly his most impressive. It was the reason he was often allowed to get away with the things he did, until he was old and vulnerable, of course. Paul Sykes was a name that put the fear of God into the hardest of men all over England. But was it a myth, or was he really the real deal? I'd like to go through a few factual elements with you. The facts are, Paul Sykes was a trained boxer from a young age. Paul went through every level in amateur boxing that you could. Then, of course, we all know what he did as a pro. For anyone that doesn't know or hasn't boxed, what I'd like to point out is the advantages you have over the average man who doesn't box is great, in my opinion. It's the little things, like having the knowledge to take that little step back, your ability to transfer your weight into your punches from your hips, or just knowing to adjust your feet on point. It's the little things like taking that half step back so you can see your opponent's attack while evading it. Then you can counter him with bad intentions. Bad intentions were what Paul Sykes was really about in nearly every aspect of his life. Not only was he blessed with boxing skill, but he was also gifted with the power of the punch. Even when he was young and light, his clubmate Keith Tate, now sadly passed away since the first book, told me Paul could always bang even when he was really light. When you take all that into the equation and throw in that he was freakishly strong, you quickly realize that Sykes had the full package. You've only to look at what Paul was squatting on his Paul Sykes at Large documentary, which was filmed in 1989. A former powerlifter told me that on that clip Paul was squatting 190 kilograms, which is the equivalent of lifting just under 30 stone. When I asked if that was good for a 43-year-old man, which Paul was at the time, he replied, "It's good for any bloody age." When you think of a prime Paul Sykes, you'd have to say it would have been around 1973, when he sparred with Joe Frazier, and he'll have been 27 years old. That was Paul at the peak of his powers, and if he'd have been allowed to have turned pro, he may well have won that elusive British heavyweight title. In many of Paul's violent confrontations, he, like Middlesbrough's most notorious Lee Duffy, relied on that big punch. I would say for Paul, 99 times out of 100 it worked, and they wouldn't be left standing after he threw that huge Sykes right hand. You can clearly see why when John L. Gardner stood and took it, Sykes ran out of ideas. There is no question about it, though, on the streets or in prison, Paul was a pure savage. He really was, as he so eloquently put it, an expert on violence. And as he also added, he had been at it all his life. When you put that all into the mix, Paul, having the capabilities with boxing skill, power, athleticism, no fear, and hideous strength, it was a deadly combination. And then to think that he had anger issues anyway, and used drugs and drank excessively, it doesn't bear thinking about. The man would not suffer fools gladly, and the way he dealt with that is by punching people. To say that Paul had a great passion for punching people from the ages of 15 to 55, I would say is the biggest understatement in this whole book. In prison I was told that he was a special man who feared nobody. Paul inside jail would become bitter, angry, and bide his time, like a tiger stalking its prey through the long grass. Although angry most of the time, what separated Sykes from your average everyday criminal was he was cold, calculated, and mentally switched on. If it took him 8 weeks until he got someone he saw who'd taken a liberty with him, then he would make sure his own kind of retribution was carried out, usually in the showers.